You met Professor Ellen Goddard as a moderator of the first session last week. Ellen is an agricultural economist with 35 years of experience working in consumer behavior and food marketing. She's currently the Co-operative Chair in Agricultural Marketing and Business at the University of Alberta, and has also worked at the University of Guelph in Ontario and the University of Melbourne in Australia. She teaches about agricultural cooperatives, agricultural marketing, and globalization. Her current research focuses on the acceptance of new agricultural technologies by consumers and producers, and changing consumer behavior for meat and other livestock products. She recently served on the Alberta Local Food Council and the Council of Canadian Academies expert panel on the socio-economic implications of antimicrobial resistance. Over to you, Ellen.
Thanks very much, John. I'm hoping everybody can hear me, and I'm going to launch right into my presentation. I'm going to start at one end of the supply chain, and that's an area that I do a lot of research in, and I'm going to start with what happens in consumer purchasing, particularly in the context of a pandemic like COVID-19. I'm going to start with the big picture, which is largely going to be about income effects, and I will evolve down to some price effects of particular things that have happened in supply chains and turn it over to James at that point. This is a picture for Canadians about what's been going on in terms of two big macro forces that will drive food supply chains through their effects on consumer behavior and public behavior. The first is the unemployment rate, which you can see has skyrocketed starting in March and moving into April, and I suspect when we get the results for May, it will be even worse. GDP is another factor that we're a little bit unclear of. The data from Stats Canada only goes as far as February, and you can see it's starting to flatten out. But gross domestic product in Canada is likely to turn downward due to some of the closures that we've had during the shutdown period and some of the restrictions on reopening our economy that we're currently working our way through at different rates across the country. Both of those things are going to have a large impact on disposable income in households. And linking to what Sven talked about last week, we will have a link through those income effects directly to food security issues, particularly for wages, for seniors' income, and to a certain extent for employment insurance issues. We are likely to see many more people move into a more severe food security status, particularly if they're already in those groups. Some of the 91% of Canadians who are not facing food security prior to the COVID-19 incident may certainly face it afterwards. And how those people are supported will have a big impact on the food supply chain. I just wanted to give you a little tiny bit of history of what goes on in Canada. The red lines all have to do with places that sell groceries and alcohol, and convenience stores which sell a lot of food. And you can see that those trends are relatively flat. The black line is food service and restaurants and bars and that whole set of our economy. And you can see that it has been certainly since about 2011, steadily increasing as a place where food is sold in Canada, representing almost 30% of an individual's food expenditures in Canada. And that has been the sector that has been most devastated in some ways due to the COVID-19 outbreak. So this is where we are. If we think about the effects of COVID-19 on food expenditure. First of all, we've got unemployment. We also have illness in certain groups in society, and both of those can lead to income falling, which will have some direct effects on aggregate food expenditure. If we project a 7% decline in income in 2020, we will not only get a minus 1% change in food expenditure, we will also see a change in how that food expenditure is spent. We're going to see a very big drop in expenditure on food away from home, independent of the restaurant closures that we've seen for the last 2 months. So if you add those in, it's going to be quite a dramatic effect. And an increase, actually, in expenditure on food at home, moving it back from restaurants to grocery stores. If we continue to see income effects into 2021, which is probably a certainty at this point, a 3% decline in disposable income in 2021 will continue to put pressure on restaurant or food away from home sales and move those sales into grocery stores. So that's just from the income effects of this outbreak across the economy. But we also had a shutdown of restaurants and bars, and many of those have not opened fully, may not open fully again this year. There's some question about whether some of them will ever open again. And that directly diminishes food away from home expenditure. If we think about it, we've gone from 30% of our food spending at restaurants to probably around 5% of our food spending at restaurants at the current time. And that has put huge pressure on grocery stores to be able to satisfy the demand for food that is coming forward. Just so you know, the grocery store chains, 2 of which I've identified at the top of this slide, are doing pretty well as of the first quarter of this year. I'm pretty sure they're going to continue to do pretty well in the second quarter of this year. But we've also seen lots of effects on their bottom line. They've had to hire more employees. They've had to provide additional support to employees. They've raised wages for their employees because they realize how important their employees are. They've created different shopping periods for older and more vulnerable shoppers, which requires more staffing and more sanitizing of grocery stores and more hours of work for their employees. They've had to do physical changes to their grocery stores to try and protect the health of their staff and customers. And those are some of the costs that they've absorbed out of the changes that are necessary in the face of the COVID outbreak. We've had some interesting other effects. First of all, if you remove demand from the restaurant sector, which was consuming 30% of our food transactions prior to the COVID outbreak, then we've had to actually change regulations for some food processors so that food could be moved over into retail. Rules are different for food that is provided to restaurants than it is to provided to final consumers in terms of packaging, package sizes, labeling. All sorts of requirements are different for final consumers than for restaurants. And Health Canada had to waive some of those rules so that we could actually move food through the grocery store chains rather than through restaurants. And that was an interesting innovation. As well, the Competition Bureau has decided that they would look favorably, or not look unfavorably, I guess is a better way to put it, at cooperation among retailers, for example, to try and smooth out supply chains that had to adjust overnight. And that also is an interesting innovation that has been put in to try and smooth out our supply disturbances. It's not that they're going to look favorably at people colluding to raise prices, but if they are cooperating to make things smoother and there's no evidence of unfair pricing, then they probably will not question some of those actions. I think the food retailers have recognized that they were doing particularly well, and we've seen an enormous contribution from food retailers into trying to alleviate food security issues throughout Canada. I also want you to recognize that in terms of employment throughout the food supply chain in Canada, that food service employee share is one of the biggest components of employees in the entire food system. That's the black line on this graph. It's interesting that that is also the sector that has been most heavily hit. Brent mentioned in his first presentation that we lost at least 800,000 people's jobs almost immediately with the shutdown of that sector. It's not clear when, if ever, some of those people will be reemployed in that particular sector, and it's become doubly hard once our universities closed for the summer, and many of those students would also have been normally looking for jobs in that sector to be able to fund their university studies in the subsequent year. I put in a couple of slides just to show you how creatively people in other parts of the world are trying to handle physical distancing at the same time as trying to keep their restaurants open. Burger King is just doing it to be funny, I think. But I just want you to recognize that the costs in the food service industry, whether or not they ever get back to full employment, are going to be quite a bit higher than they have been in the past to try and maintain services, increase sanitization, and restrict people's entry into that sector. And this is going to have very long-standing effects. But I also want you to recognize that we have lost, in some senses, some trust in the food system. There's an entire generation of people in Canada who it was unheard of in their entire lives that they would ever go to a grocery store and the shelves might be empty. We don't have a single Canadian that isn't aware now that shelves can be empty at some point. We also have had a whole generation of people in Canada who never faced a health threat to the significance of what has been going on for the last 2 months. How that insecurity is going to fuel purchasing behavior across time is something there are many questions about. In this slide, McKinsey and Company have been tracking how people feel about shopping at a variety of sectors. And you can see that it's quite variable across the globe as to how people feel about whether they're going to be shopping in physical grocery stores once they're allowed and they're more widely open, whether they will shop in non-food stores, whether they will ever go to a mall again, and whether they will travel domestically. However, this slide, which is for a variety of reasons an interesting study that I've put the link for in the references, is showing that perhaps concerns are starting to decline a bit as we are getting more used to the idea of the pandemic, and also as gradually things are starting to open. So we don't see such a frenzy for information. However, I don't know that we know the long-term effects of the changes in risk perceptions and the fear that consumers are feeling about some normally familiar behavior that they had before the pandemic, and how that will roll out. If we switch over to the other side of the equation, what's been happening in food prices? This is the FAO Food Price Index that all of you would be aware of, and you can see that the red line outlining 2020 aggregate food price behavior is quite different than it has been for quite a number of years, and it's on a steady decline. If we look at the food prices by category, you can see that there have been fairly dramatic declines in things like vegetable oils and sugar, and some of that may be representative of the fact that the restaurant sector has been widely hit globally. You can see that meat is on a downward trend and dairy is on a slightly downward trend, and cereals are relatively flat. There are concerns in the food system, but largely these effects on price that are in the first couple of months of the pandemic are being driven, I think, mostly by people's worry about economic outcomes associated with the pandemic. Just to give you a little bit of a handle, you can see that the CPI for all items in Canada has been relatively flat, if not slightly declining in terms of the end period of this graph, which is April 2020. You can see that the orange line, which is going up and in April of 2020, is still not a very dramatic increase in food prices in Canada. And Canada's luckily having one of the lowest percentages of disposable income spent on food in the world. I just put the gasoline price trend on because I suspect nobody is as aware of gasoline prices as people might be in Alberta, but it's pretty low right now, and partly what's driving the negative impact on the CPI for Canadians. But we've had lots of things go on in grocery stores that have terrified people. The first thing that happened was we stopped being able to buy bathroom tissue in grocery stores. Apparently everybody wanted lots of it. And our paper manufacturers are saying, but we've got lots of it. Don't worry, guys, it will come. The second thing that happened is people started to buy foods at grocery stores that they could use to make other foods. I think every Canadian that was locked down decided they needed to bake bread, for example. And our flour manufacturers were able to supply flour, but they no longer had their packages. So we now get our flour in these plain white packages in most grocery stores. Things like milk were really decimated by the restaurant closures. An awful lot of milk and cream had gone into purchases through certain types of restaurants. Coffee shops, for example, used a lot of dairy products prior to COVID-19. Almost immediately, we couldn't figure out how to get the milk to consumers through grocery stores. The people that had manufactured for restaurants didn't have packages that could be sold in grocery stores, for example. So an awful lot of milk got dumped, which worried people because they were seeing limits on how much milk they could buy at the grocery store. And if they wanted milk, how come the farmers were dumping it? We've seen some of those supply issues be resolved. The last one I want to mention has to do a little bit with trade, but an awful lot to do with integrated markets and health. We, in North America, have seen our meat processing industry decimated by health issues. And this is not necessarily as a result of bad behavior by our meat processing companies. There's abundant evidence that they tried to do as much as they possibly could at the beginning of this pandemic to try and keep the plants safe for their workers. They recognized that as an essential service, they needed to be protective, and they needed to be able to keep the supply going through the plants. However, I don't think anybody realized how this pandemic was going to roll out or how infectious it was going to be. And as a result, right across North America, meat plants have been closed, causing more or less severe supply chain blockages and effects that James will certainly tell you about. Fundamentally, though, we have to remember that an awful lot of the economic effects on how consumers are going to change what they purchase and when they purchase it and where they purchase it. We have to remember that people getting ill through our grocery store chains, through restaurants, if we do open them up, through our food processing industry. It isn't only meat that's been affected. We've had other food processing firms affected in Canada. All of those things related to illness have a huge impact, and beyond the devastating personal impacts for people who work in those industries. Somebody asked a question to Sven last week about what's been happening to plant-based meats. And you might think that this is a perfect environment for plant-based meats. And I think from every interview I've seen with anybody who works in the plant-based meat industry that they're perceiving it that way. They certainly see it as an additional opportunity. They certainly see people picking up the products in grocery stores or ordering them online whenever meat sales are down, particularly in the United States. One of the problems with plant-based meat is up until recently, it's been quite a bit more expensive on a per unit of protein basis than traditional meats. So they're aggressively trying to lower their price to see if they can pick up market share. But I think we have to recognize that there's still a relatively small share of the protein market in North America. I think actually some of the milk-like substitute beverage products have a bigger share of that market than the plant-based meats do of the meat market. Beyond Meat says that their penetration may be as much as 4% in US households. It would be a slightly bit smaller than that now. And with that, I'll turn it back to John to introduce James. Thanks.